help me facilitate that.
I just clicked recording and it seems to be working.
All right.
Magic.
Thanks so much, Mark. All right, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. No matter where you are in the world, thank you for joining us. My name is Neil DeSantiseo, and I'm an events manager and international development fellow for the Young Professionals in Foreign Policy, also known as YPFP. YPFP works to build the leaders tomorrow needs. And we do this by providing YPFP members with capacity building programs, engaging events, a global community of peers, and opportunities to elevate their voices through writing and publication. Tonight, we are delighted to have Ambassador Nancy Soderberg of the National Democratic Institute and Mr. Jan Surotchak of the International Republican Institute join us today for a discussion on democracy during the pandemic. As we're all aware, the United States just went through a very contentious, very closely watched election cycle, one that saw significant shifts to mail-in voting and in-person early voting, a record turnout, and an election that quickly turned into an election week. But of course, the topic of the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on democracy goes well beyond the borders of just the United States. And that's why we have Ambassador Soderberg and Mr. Surotchak with us this evening. I checked with them beforehand. They have allowed me to call them Nancy and Jan, so that's how we'll be referring to them this evening. Before I formally introduce them and get into what I'm sure will be a great discussion, I have a few administrative items to go over. First, the format of this event. When planning this event, we wanted to ensure that the discussion was driven by audience participation. So after I pose my first 3 questions and get some responses from our panelists, I'll then open up the floor for audience members to pose their own questions. There are 2 ways you can do this. First, you may submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. YPFP staff will help me organize questions and pose them to our panelists. If you can, please specify to whom you would like your questions asked. If you don't, I will make that decision, or Jan or Nancy could also take that helm and tackle them as they come. Second, if you'd like to verbally ask your question, you may use the raise your hand feature, and I'll try my best to get to you and unmute your mic so that you may ask the panelists your question yourself. A final note before I get started, there is no doubt that, like democracy itself, discussions on this very topic can quickly become heated and fraught. But this evening, I want to ask everyone in this event to demonstrate civility, patience, and an open mind for those who may not think exactly like you. I say this to reiterate where we stand as YPFP, but I know you'll all do just fine tonight. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Nancy Soderberg and Jan Surotchak. First, let's start with Nancy. Nancy serves as the National Democratic Institute's Senior Resident Director for Kosovo. She joined NDI with 3 decades of experience promoting democracy in the US Congress, the White House, at the United Nations, and leading nonprofit organizations. She also has significant experience supporting US presidential campaigns, working in state and local politics, and running for elected office. She's an expert in conflict resolution, peacekeeping, and advancing the role of women in democracy. Nancy was appointed in 1995 as the first woman Deputy National Security Advisor, and later in 1997 as the alternate representative for the United States to the United Nations with the rank of ambassador. Nancy serves as Vice Chair of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy and is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. Nancy earned her Master's of Science in Development Economics from Georgetown and her Bachelor of Arts from Vanderbilt University. She's a regular commentator on national and international television and radio, as well as the author of several books and numerous articles on American foreign policy. And she speaks, as you heard, English, but also French. Thank you, Nancy, for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Neil.
Appreciate it. And now we'll go ahead and introduce Jan Surotchak. Jan first joined the International Republican Institute in 1994 and currently serves as Senior Director for Transatlantic Strategy. At this critical time in the evolution of the US-European relationship, Surotchak oversees IRI regional programming that focuses on the key threats to the alliance of democratic societies in the transatlantic space, including state-sponsored disinformation efforts to undermine state institutions and public confidence, weaknesses among traditional political parties, and the rise of anti-establishment political movements and leaders. and growing engagement by authoritarian powers designed to drive the US and its European allies apart. From 2013 to 2018, Surotchak served as IRI's regional director for Europe and managed programming in the Baltic states, Central and Southeastern Europe, and Turkey, as well as outreach efforts to partner parties in Western Europe and institutions at the EU level. Prior to that, he was director of IRI's regional program for Central and Eastern Europe, based in Bratislava, Slovakia, where he is right now, and worked in 17 different countries to strengthen political parties and government institutions. Jan earned a master's in law and diplomacy from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in 1987, and a bachelor's degree in international relations from Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania in 1984. Jan speaks, reads, and writes German and Slovak, and reads Czech and Russian. Jan, thanks for joining us this evening. All right, without further ado, I'd like to get right into it with both of you with a few opening questions. This one will be pretty long. There's a little bit of a run up to the question itself. So last month in October, Freedom House, an organization that conducts research and advocacy on democracy, political freedom, and human rights, released a report entitled Democracy Under Lockdown, in which they state the pandemic has fueled a crisis for democracy around the world. Their research reveals that the pandemic is exacerbating the already 14 years of consecutive decline in freedom and has weakened democracy in 80 countries, whether that be in the form of media suppression, electoral or legislative meeting disruption, police violence, among others. In June, more than 500 political and civil leaders, Nobel laureates, and pro-democracy institutions, including the presidents of both of your organizations, signed an open letter to defend democracy, citing similar concerns. Could you share with us what your reaction is to these assessments? What concerns you most about the state of democracy in your area of expertise or around the globe more generally today? Nancy, I'll go ahead and start with you.
Well, thanks so much, Neil, for having me, and it's wonderful to be with Jan. And I want to just start out commending the YPFP for this incredible programming. I got a chance to hear from Neil a little bit about how active you are and how important that is. So it's an honor for me to be able to join such a great group. I also have to give a shout out to Neil, who actually worked on one of my campaigns and was just fantastic. So when he asked me, I immediately saying yes to everything. And it's a real pleasure to meet Jan. I've known IRI's leadership for a long time. In fact, Lauren Craner and I worked on the Hill when we were kids together. And that's where we learned bipartisanship and working together. And we tag teamed our careers so that we were so sad to lose him recently. But so
thank you, Nancy.
I've worked with IRI most of my career. And it's just an honor to be on the panel with you as well. The Freedom House, for which I have enormous respect, and of course read the report and read most of Freedom House's reports. I commend you all to those reports. Democracy is under risk all around the world. We have a rise in authoritarianism. Freedom House has been tracking it 14 years in a row. There are less democracies today than there were a decade ago, and many, many becoming more fragile. And I think we all kind of gloated at the end of the Cold War, democracies, won, the Fukuyama end of history. And what we're finding is that democracy is a lot more fragile than I think we all expected, and it needs care and nurturing, checks and balances. And I think the pandemic has given us a clarion call of really urgent need to address these underlying crises. All the studies find, and we see this in Kosovo, the political divisions are tougher. The information's flying about the fake cures and the rumors spread and disinformation. The internet makes all this false information spread faster and can undermine democracy. So as leveling as the internet can be, it is also exacerbating the cracks in all of our democracies. And the state of women, I think, in leadership positions is being hurt by the pandemic. They're home taking care of their kids, and we see rise in misogyny, violence against women online. So I think COVID gives us all a chance to pause and evaluate where we are and recommit ourselves when we come out of this to tackling these issues more forcefully, because the pandemic has ripped the veneer of everything's fine off of our society. So I think for all of us, we need to recommit to the values that we all are working for, which is democracy, bipartisanship, trying to lift all boats, and as Jan said, real solutions to try and get these problems moving in the other direction. It's 2021. We should see democracies growing, not shrinking.
Thanks, Nancy. And Jan, would you like to respond?
Thanks, Neil. So let me piggyback on Nancy's comments and say thank you for the invitation. 100 million years ago, when I was young and first came to Washington, I was part of a group called the Under 40 Forum for Foreign Affairs, which does sort of the same kind of thing that you're doing here. So my hat's off to you and to all of the folks who are involved in the effort to make these discussions happen. Thank you. Much appreciated. Hugely important. You know, America, for all sorts of reasons, historical, geographic, economic, all sorts of reasons, has a tendency every once in a while to want to try to isolate itself from the rest of the world and pretend that, you know, it can use the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans as a moat. And we all know that that is just proven by history again and again to be false. Thank you for making sure that young people come into this field and have exposure to these kinds of discussions. And Nancy, thank you for your comments about Lorne. Lorne Craner, for those of you who are listening, the former president of IRI, was one of my best friends on the planet. And he was, for me, the model of what it means to be a Republican foreign policy professional, because he understood. He told me once, and I share this with everybody I can, if there are in any discussion or any negotiation 10 issues, and 2 will never get answered, and 2 get answered easily, you got to focus on the 6 in the middle. That's what I try to do in my work at IRI to live up to Lorne's model. I think what we have seen in the pandemic across the world is an expression of the need by parties and governments to balance between the very serious and real need that citizens perceive for security, whatever that looks like, whether it's health security, travel security, all of the rest of the securities that make it possible for us to live our lives and to be productive and prosperous. On the other hand, the natural temptation by political parties and governments to use a situation to acquire more power. Neil, you and Nancy and I, before we started, for the rest of the group, were talking about what I still believe is the genius of the American founding documents. And I think it's been shown once again to be the case, right? Political people in political positions, people in parties and people in governments inevitably reach for and try to assume more power than individual constitutions and individual governing documents naturally ascribe to them. We shouldn't be surprised by that, right? And sometimes they do it for the best of motives, and sometimes they do it for the worst of motives. To me, the question is whether or not the measures that had been put in place by governments around the globe, and certainly here in Europe, during the course of the pandemic, are rolled back as fast and as efficiently and as completely as possible once the pandemic is done, right? I think we all expect that travel restrictions are a normal part of this, right? I think we all expect that restrictions on gatherings of large groups of people are part of this, right? They are measures that need to be undertaken in order to limit the spread of the disease and its impact, but they need to be rolled back. And I think we need to be particularly vigilant, Nancy, in your work at NDI and ours here at IRI and Freedom House and the others, to make sure that once this thing is done, once there's a vaccine, once people feel that they can safely interact with each other again, that we don't have measures left in place that limit freedoms that may have been well considered in the middle of a crisis, but have no place ultimately in the continuing function of democratic societies. And that, frankly, is going to be, frankly, a little tougher than maybe just highlighting the issues when they were put in place. Because once people go back to their regular lives and their regular jobs, and, you know, Nancy, as you accurately said, taking care of their homes and families and kids, right? People are maybe going to be tempted to look the other way and not want to go back. And I think we have to be particularly vigilant to make sure that these things get rolled back to the status quo ante, or, you know, in a perfect world, perhaps even further in some cases. Correct.
Thanks, Jan. And I'm glad that you brought up the genius of the founding fathers and the strength of the Constitution. I'm certainly interested, though, to hear from y'all's perspective what differences might exist in the challenge faced by more fledgling democracies, younger democracies, where they just don't have the same level of experience that, say, the United States has, versus those that may be more mature. As you see it, how has this difference informed countries' treatments of elections or other aspects of democracy? Nancy, I know that you're the Senior Resident Director for Kosovo at NDI, so just wanted to see if you had sort of an instance or an example that comes to mind.
Well, I think what the pandemic has done is reveal the cracks in more fragile democracies. I think certainly in the Balkans and Kosovo and around, we've seen more political division, more infighting. People are losing their jobs. I mean, every measure of society is getting worse in the pandemic. And I think what foreign policy experts ought to look at, and this is certainly something I'm personally thinking about, is once the pandemic is over, and frankly, even before, and we have a transition of power going on in Washington and the world's been shaken by this pandemic, can we use this to think through how to make the global infrastructures more responsive to the needs of the globe? The top 8 men of the world own more wealth than the bottom 4 billion in the world. That is a prescription right there for instability. And there's the internet, everyone can see how the other half lives really well. And so this is also what's giving rise to authoritarianism. They're angry, they're susceptible to those narratives. And so let's think through, let's take this time to think through what about our international institutions that need to be revitalized? The UN Security Council, why is it still stuck in the 1960s and you don't have a UN Security Council that's reflective of the world? The President Trump certainly has pointed out weaknesses in NATO, in the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization. Let's take advantage of the change in sort of attitudes in the world to maybe we can upgrade those. And I think I would like to see also, and I think this is a message to everyone in this room, both Jan and I worked hard to try and make the world a better place throughout our career. And I'm very proud, as I'm sure he is, of what I've done, but we left you guys a mess. So take it upon yourself, to that George Bernard Shaw quote, which I always mangle, but some see things as they are and ask why. I see things as they could be and ask why not. Take that to your heart. Your generation is the most tolerant in the world, mostly because you have your relationships on the phone. You aren't questioning climate change. You understand that you're one citizen out of 8 billion, soon to be 10. We've got to get a handle on this climate change. You're incredibly well educated. The fact that you're in this group means that you understand you're part of a global world. And if you have a website, you have an international business today. We're so interconnected. So get involved in the institutions of government that can change that. If you're in business, fine, go make your money, but then think about how you can change the world from that platform. Because when I was younger, it's always they are doing this. Well, let me tell you, you are the next they, and you have the power to change these things. So use this time to think creatively about how can we shift the pillars to address these challenges more directly, but also address that bottom half that is going to cause trouble if they don't see a path to prosperity. Everybody wants the same, that they want a prosperous life in comparison to the neighbors. Now that's different if you live in Kosovo or if you live in India or if you live in the United States, but it's doing better than your kids and having a chance to provide for your family. So I think we need to have that conversation now. And I always talk about making lemonade out of the COVID lemon. And I think we need to take this opportunity to really think and say, let's work together and move forward.
Great, thanks. And Jan, is there something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. Thank you, Nancy. I agree with all of that. I would just say, maybe I would just make 2 points, perhaps. One, in my experience doing this work in many, many countries now for well over 20 years, I think most people just want their governments to work, right? Nobody believes deep down, when you unravel it all, that governments can fix all problems. Nobody believes that governments can magically wave a wand and prevent the pandemic or stop the pandemic, right? They just want to know, when all is said and done, that the people that they have elected are doing the very best they can to provide the best possible conditions for the average person. I always call these people in real places to live and work, right? And if governments are perceived to be doing that, then they will be rewarded. And, I don't want to devolve only into European politics, because I know we have a global, an audience that's interested globally on the line. But, I look at the government of Germany, which is, I think, generally regarded as having handled this really well, as opposed to other governments in Europe, which have not. Second point. So Neil, in your introduction, what you didn't mention is that I did 17 years on my borough council back in Pennsylvania. And I can tell you that from that experience, that what people really care about, really care about, go out and go to meetings about, is, whether their lives on the street that they live on are functional. Nancy, I'm sure you have, I know I have done trainings for people going into politics all over the world. And, there's this very high-minded idea that we go into politics for, grand philosophies. I'm a Thatcherite, or I'm a, this, that, or the other thing. Really, what it comes down to is math. And people want to know that the math is going to work out. When they send somebody to a position in government, they want to know that that things are going to work. And in this regard, one of my great sort of ideological mentors is a Democrat, and that's Tip O'Neill, who talked about all politics being local. Now, yes, of course, governments are elected nationally, parliaments are elected nationally, presidents, heads of state, heads of government, all the rest elected nationally. But they succeed when they make local conditions work. And right now, the record on how governments and parties have handled COVID is pretty mixed. We've got some really good examples, and we've got some really bad examples. And I think after my experience in politics says that those parties and governments that are perceived to have managed it well will be rewarded, and those that are perceived to have failed will not. And that strikes me as healthy and productive and, frankly, predictable.
I'll just add on to that is in your math question, I agree with that. And I think one of the things that gives rise to authoritarianism, we saw this very much after the end of the Cold War, democracy was chaotic under Yeltsin, and they actually chose the certainty under a communist, more authoritarian system built up under Putin, because they had an apartment again and things kind of worked. Yep. And we see what's going on in Afghanistan right now. The Taliban might come to power because it was at least not so chaotic, and they might come back. And so it's up to democracies to listen to that math and to deliver. And I also think it's important to look at the role of women. The reason that Merkel did so well on COVID is she kind of brought in the experts and just listened and took tough steps. And if you look at the places where COVID has been managed the best, and I'll say this, not trying to defend the two men I'm on the panel with, but they were run by women. New Zealand, Thailand, Taiwan, it's interesting because they really they're more inclusive by nature. They listen to the scientists and they're not afraid to sort of take the tough measures. And I think that's one of the lessons that's going to come out of watching COVID is people are going to begin to see that women are good managers and do the math. And I think in a way, right now it's bad for women, but I think when people kind of look back at how people handled the COVID crisis, I think it's going to be a little bit of a reckoning that women are good in government, even though they're not necessarily envisioning it even themselves. They always have this imposter syndrome, oh, I don't belong in that room. And I think, I'm hoping this is one of the lemonades out of the lemon of the COVID is that we can actually build up a better understanding of how important it is to have women at the table and in positions of power to offer those countering views.
Let me just add Zuzana Čaputová, the president of the Slovak Republic, to your list.
She's on it, actually. Yeah, I always forget to list them all, but yeah, she's pretty impressive, actually. Yeah, she's making a name for herself. And it's
responsiveness. So that's what I'm hearing from both of you is young, old democracies, what people are fundamentally looking for from their governments is responsiveness to their lives. All right, I'm gonna do one more question. We'll do this pretty quickly and then I'll open the floor for the audience to ask some questions. I know that we've been talking a lot about doom and gloom, what the trends are saying according to Freedom House, but I certainly want to ask you all, despite concerns about the state of democracy, especially during this pandemic, what trends or examples from your experience keep you hopeful that the development of liberal democracy around the world will, in spite of its hardships, continue?
Yeah, I want to go first. I don't mean to always go first.
Thanks. Yeah, no, sure. Listen, I came into politics in the late 1970s and early 1980s because of Ronald Reagan, right? He was the first president I ever voted for. So yes, you all now know how old I am, and it is very old. But Ronald Reagan taught me that things don't have to be the way they are. And that nothing in politics or government is ever static, right? We have a tendency, I think, and I used to work for Freedom House, right? I have all the respect in the world for Freedom House, right? But every Freedom House analysis is a snapshot, right? And to me, the bigger picture, when we look over time, like over the arc of time, is this, and that is that more people who live in democracies around the world have more prosperous, more productive, more fulfilling lives than offered by any other system, right? We can agree or disagree about what might be happening, for example, with the BJP in India. But India is a remarkable success story of democracy, right? The world's largest democracy. Individual countries in Europe may be going in one direction or another at any given period of time. But if we look over the arc of time, despite what the Chinese government, the government run by the Chinese Communist Party would try to sell in its narrative, despite what the Putin government in Russia would try to sell in its narrative, democracy, although it's messy, although it's cumbersome, although it's chaotic, although it sometimes takes a long time to count the votes, ultimately gives more people a fundamental stake in the system than any other type of government we have figured out. And I think for the most part, what I have seen in my lifetime is that people will accept the messiness, people will accept the fact that it's cumbersome, people will accept the fact that it's slow and loud and sometimes confusing if it delivers. And I have no doubt in my heart at all, as Ronald Reagan did not, that that is the view that will prevail over time, right? Not at every moment, right? If we were looking at the world in 1940, for example, the perspective would be pretty darn dim, right? But already by 1960, just 20 years later, we were in a completely different place. And what Freedom House tells me is that over time, people want to move toward democracy. And I think that's the great message this year of a place like Hong Kong or Taiwan or the others that, look at Bobby Wine, the amazing figure in Uganda. People who have stood up time and time again to try to drive government back into the hands of the people. That message always wins in the long run.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We were talking before the rest of you came on about how everyone had this horrible, concern about whether our own democracy here was going to work. And it did. And it sent an important message that while they might want to change the top, they wanted the bottom to be of a different party. And the American people decided they like kind of having a divided government because we like to have debate. And it's so far, the United States democracy has survived well over 200 years and is still an example to the rest of the world. But also you got to work at it. And I think what people need to understand is that democracy is not a spectator sport. And you have to get in and work it. I always say, if someone doesn't vote, you can't argue about anything. And it's fine if you voted some way that is different from me, then let's argue about it. But do make sure that you participate, certainly by voting, but take time off and try a stint in government. I always laugh when people say, oh, everybody in government's an idiot. And it's like, I'd go solve this if I were there. I was like, go try it. And when you get in there, you realize, first of all, how hard the people in government work. And how hard the problems are. And these problems exist because they're hard. And so you need the political will, the expertise. And I'll just encourage your generation to think hard about what kind of stints could you do to learn about it? Could you help on your local city council, or could you run for some kind of office? Could you take some time off and go work in government or go work on a project overseas? And first of all, it's fun. Changing up your life, it just kind of puts you back on fire, and you feel there's nothing more rewarding than feeling like you're part of a bigger cause, and you're working for something that's bigger, and you're part of you're part of something that is really affecting change. I always, maybe it's because I knew my grandparents very well, but I've always, since I was a little kid, I always said, why am I here? What's the point if when I'm 90 and I look back and I didn't change the world? You want to be able to have had a little impact, because otherwise, okay, it's fun. You can make a lot of money and have fun, but then in the end, so think about what is your legacy when you're 90, and it doesn't have to be a big project. It can be a small neighborhood project. It can be a, global solve malaria like the Gates Foundation, but whatever is in your heart to sort of say, yeah, that's my legacy. Just start thinking about it now, because those kind of legacies, by the way, don't happen in 2 years. And also think hard about, most people do their great things by the time they're mid-30s. So just go for it. If you have an inkling, don't listen to the naysayers. If you fall flat on your face, you're still young enough to start over again. But think about history, and if you're going to do something, now's the time to do it.
All right. Thanks for those doses of hope. And as someone who works for the government, thank you for acknowledging that we're not all idiots. All right, thanks for those insights. Let's open up the floor for audience members to ask some questions of their own. It looks like we have a couple to start. Let me see here. The first one comes from Katie Cripple. She says, as an analyst at the Rendon Group, I'd love to hear Nancy's insights into Russian disinformation in the Balkans.
Well, I wouldn't limit it to just the Balkans. It's global. And Russia has figured out very effectively, and I don't think the world has figured out how to counter that yet, that false information and embedded with clickbaits can change narratives all over the place. We see it in Kosovo. You've got Sputnik all over the Serbian media, affecting their views. And it was exacerbated in COVID because there was just clickbait about somebody had a new cure, or these crazy things that if you're only tall people get COVID, or only short people get COVID, or this is a cure and that's a cure. And the clickbaits were just frightening about it. But I think on a more lasting level, they try and sow distrust in government institutions. Certainly they're trying to increase divisions between Kosovo and Serbia, and they don't even hide. And literally Sputnik is in the Serbian media spreading this stuff, and they're not even trying to hide it. And you see that throughout the Balkans. You see it in other spheres of influence in the former Soviet Union countries in spades. And I think Putin figured out before the rest of us did that this stuff works. And we're behind the curve trying to figure out how to combat it. Now, lots of countries are now trying to call it out and come up with toolkits that society can recognize, first of all, recognize it, know how to counter it, and don't fall for that. And that's a vast education effort that we're well behind, and it's a real danger.
Neil, could I add to that, if you don't mind, please?
Sure, of course.
Agreed on all points, Nancy. The only thing I would add, I think, is that, in the end, disinformation, it seems to me, by state sponsors like the Russian Federation, but I would also add the Chinese Communist Party and some others, Tayyip Erdogan's Turkey, Iran, we could talk about the list. But those, from my perspective, those disinformation efforts only find fertile ground when they latch on to existing cleavages in society. The reason why selling a narrative like only tall people get COVID works is that people don't understand enough about the way the disease really works. So we do have to fight the source of the disinformation, but then at home, we also have to close those gaps, right? Whether they're education gaps or income gaps or access gaps, excuse me, whatever gaps they are in our democracies that open up the space for the authoritarians to abuse, right? In the end, the protection of our democracies is on us, right? Not on them, it's on us. And so, to me, one of the greatest things that organizations like IRI and NDI, and, I don't know exactly who's on the line tonight or today, tonight for me here. One of the greatest things that IRI and NDI do is, try to make sure that at the very base level, our democracies work, right? And that, in the end, is in the American interest. I know that there's a school of thought in the United States that we shouldn't be involved in these things, but what I've seen over time is that Democrats and Republicans have a common interest in supporting the development of democracies outside the United States because fundamentally, it's in the American interest to do so.
And I would just agree with all of that, and would just add a comment to that we aren't going to ever get rid of disinformation.
Correct.
I think it's here to stay. It's too effective. It's too uncontrollable. Bot farms are cheap, and it's just too all of us click. I mean, we're all subject to it. This, we all get flashes on our phones. Like, you can't not look. You got to open it. And so it's all about education and learning how to combat it. And that's, again, your generation's got to figure that out because it's here to stay, and it's going to get worse and more creative.
Well, I'm glad you spoke to this notion of the internet, social media, disinformation, something that we're going to have to continue to live with. I want to pose another question, also related to sort of the digital sphere, and I'll pose this one to Jan. This was from an audience member who sent this in before the event. Governments around the world are deploying digital surveillance tools to combat the spread of COVID-19.
Yep.
Are you concerned that these digital public health tools could expand the surveillance powers of authoritarians and emerging authoritarians?
So Neil, my gut reaction is to say yes, and then just move on, right? But I won't do that. But sure, of course, right? Let me just give you my personal example, right? As you will guess from my accent, I was born in the United States, right? But but I come from a Slovak family and I carry both passports, right? So I came back to Slovakia in September. And in order to come into the country on my Slovak passport, I needed to let the Ministry of Health know when I was arriving and give them my email address and my cell phone number so that once I got here, they would be able to contact me, right? And the reason for that, of course, was that the law at the time was that within 5 days, I would need to go, after 5 days of self-isolation, I would need to go and get a COVID test, right? And so, you know, popping up, Nancy, we all do this these days, right? Popping up on my phone shortly after I arrived was my appointment to go to an assigned location to get my COVID test. Now, you know, on some level, does it unsettle me that the Slovak government knows exactly where I am and exactly when I'm supposed to go and get my COVID test? Sure, right? But the story of democracies is that we always have to make a choice about where we sacrifice a measure of individual liberty in order to have the greater benefit for the commonwealth, right? And so does it unsettle me a bit? Yeah. And does the Ministry of Health still have my data? Yeah. But do I really worry when it comes down to it about the Slovak Ministry of Health having my data? No, I don't, because I have a fundamental sort of trust in the government here to do the right thing. And that enabled me to get my COVID test, and I was negative, in order to be able to go out on the street and live life. Now, that's not the case everywhere, right? There certainly are governments that are misusing it. And I would offer, in that regard, Serbia, which not just because of COVID, but because of its chosen relationship with Beijing, has put in place surveillance measures in Serbia that, unless we're careful, and this goes back to my opening statement, unless we're careful, will not be rolled back because they will be viewed as valuable by whatever government of Serbia happens to be in place, right? So it's always this question, you know, I'm perfectly fine with that level of access for the Slovak government, but I don't think it's perfectly fine for the Serbian government to follow people using facial recognition provided by the government owned by the Chinese Communist Party, right? And we, as representatives of liberal democracies, need to work with people to figure out where those limits are, and where the limits have been overstepped, then to push back.
And I think the dirty little secret is they already have your information. Neil will remember when I was running for office, I was running for Congress a couple years ago, and I would say, okay, I know, you know, X, and I think if I call him, he'd donate, and I don't have his number. Within 3 minutes, they would have his cell phone, his home address, his email. I mean, it is all out there. It is, I mean, and it is possible to get yourself off the web, but it's really hard. So assume that it is out there, and take necessary precautions to protect your bank accounts, your information, because those cyber criminals are always ahead of us. So take seriously when they say do the duo. You know, David Sanger has a terrifying book out on cyber if you really want to keep yourself up at night. But I do think we also, as a society, haven't figured out how to stay one step ahead of those who want to misuse that information. And it's, you can imagine pretty soon how any country, any criminal can figure out who you are from your face, from your iris, from your fingerprints. So the ability to stay under the radar screen and keep your information, your privacy, is pretty much gone. And so you're naive if you don't think that somebody who wants to find out who you are can.
So Nancy, can I agree with that completely? Neil, can I add one thing to what Nancy just said?
Sure.
And it goes to maybe the folks who are in the audience tonight, you know, who are entering careers in foreign affairs and are thinking about staying in that world. Please don't ever forget, right, that when you're in future job interviews, when you're, you know, when you're thinking about your next position, we're all going to look at your Instagram accounts, right? We're all going to look at your Facebook accounts, and we're all going to look at your Twitter accounts, right? So be smart about what you post and how you represent yourself, just like you would be in public, right? The net is no different.
Thanks for that. And if you all didn't know, your information is out there. You just got to be as smart as you can be about it. And of course, your experience will vary depending on, like Jan was saying, if you fundamentally trust your government or if there are certainly reasons to distrust them. And in that vein, I know we're running up on time, but I would like to pose this final question before getting to a question about professional development. But we would love to hear your opinion on how can we even begin to hold illiberal regimes or governments accountable, especially when it comes to human rights violations committed to fulfill political goals. Who's there to protect citizens from such governments?
I'm going to take a stab.
Go for it.
The short answer is no one and everyone. There's a whole, I'm sure you've heard about the responsibility to protect doctrine that emerged after the Rwandan genocides, the Bosnian genocides. And Kofi Annan, who was head of peacekeeping at the time, said, if the principle of sovereignty at the UN keeps us from being able to intervene in those horrible tragedies, there's something wrong. So we had a commission, and 5 years later came up with the responsibility to protect doctrine, which says that it's the state's responsibility to protect its citizens where the state fails to do so or can't do it. And in some cases it's the perpetrators, right? Then that responsibility falls to the international community. And they didn't amend the charter, but that's kind of accepted. But it's on a case-by-case basis and applied very sparingly. For instance, we tried to intervene in Benghazi to save the 20,000 people that we knew Gaddafi would kill. And we did it. There are 20,000 people in Kosovo, in Benghazi, that would have been dead had we not done that. But how many more have died because of that intervention, leading to total chaos in Libya today? And whose responsibility are they? Syria, half the country of Syria was displaced. They were eating grass. Some are 4 million are in refugee camps. Are they ever going to go home? So liberal democracies are the beginning of the potential of all those crises. And so it's up to the people to stand up to those warning signs that we know what happens. It's that they eviscerate the legislatures, they start controlling the media, they start controlling the narrative. All of a sudden their opposition's in jail. How many times do we have to see this playbook? It's like a list on the way to genocide. We know the signs. And so it's incumbent on the citizens in those countries to stand up and say, no, we're not doing that. And it's hard. And so then the questions of that the people themselves can't do it, whose job is it outside the world? And I think the United States, both Democrats and Republicans, have a 70-year history now of trying to push back on that. Sanctions are really blunt instruments. I think they worked in South Africa actually pretty well. I think they kind of worked in Iran in terms of getting the Iranians to cut a deal because they wanted access to their funds. Are they working in Russia? We have huge sanctions on Russia. I don't see Russia going in the right direction. Some of the most effective sanctions I've ever seen in my life are when you sanction the whole family, because then the wives can't go shopping. The kids can't go to school in the United States. So every situation is different, but you have to, if you're going to change behavior, you have to say, well, what would cause these dictators to change the behavior? Venezuela is a case in point. I don't think anything is going to change Maduro's attitude, because everyone around him is selling gold, drugs, running a black market, and they're incredibly wealthy and they don't care about the people. And I think the present administration tried really hard to push and to recognize the opposition, and it isn't working. And whose responsibility is that? We try, but first of all, if you're interested in this field, go try, because we need more people that are going to try and understand the importance of doing that. But as Jan was saying earlier, sometimes it's a long-term game and things have an arc of history. Like democracy, it's 14 years, it's been backsliding, but if you look at from the beginning of the 19th century, it's a pretty good history. So take the long-term view as well.
Take a long-term view. And Jan, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, no, just one small footnote. Agreed again on all points. You know, Nancy, I always find these things fascinating because I think very often people in the audience want you as NDI and me as IRI to like bludgeon each other. And almost always, all right, we come out agreeing on all the major points. I would just add that signatures by governments on international documents matter, right? And I'll just focus on Europe for a second. You know, when the Soviet Union still existed and had tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in some form or another of political detention, because the Soviet Union had signed on to the Helsinki Final Act in 1975, the Western democracies in those days, the United States, had a mechanism through which it could raise those issues. And I used to work at the Helsinki Commission in Washington, and in those days, you know, you all probably don't remember what it is, but we used carbon papered copies of lists of dissidents.
I remember it.
List of dissidents who had been imprisoned by the Soviet authorities. And every time an American diplomat would meet with a Soviet diplomat, we would raise those names, right? And because the Soviet Union had signed the Helsinki Final Act, right? There's lots and lots and lots of those kinds of international multilateral accords that individual governments sign on to. But that gave us standing, right? And I think, frankly, it's the same now when it comes to some place like Belarus. Belarus is part of the OSCE, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. Therefore, all of the signatory states have standing to raise concerns about people that the Belarusian regime has attacked. And that applies to every government that signs on to those documents, whether it is called a democracy or not. And I think that matters, right? Because if we lose the essential foundation of that legal accommodation that we have found with each other, right? Once that goes away, then it is the jungle, right? But that's not the world we live in. We have these legal accommodations with each other, and that gives us standing to comment and to put pressure on governments that violate the individual human rights of their citizens.
Thank you for that. Well, I know we've come up on time, but if you all indulge me for a few more minutes, I do have one more question for you both. As you know, YPFP's mission is to build the next generation of diverse foreign policy leaders. And based on your experience, what advice would you give to the folks in the audience who may just be at the beginning of their foreign policy career or are perhaps entering the mid-level of their career? Any sort of advice that hasn't been spoken about this evening?
Yeah, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, Nancy, I think you all at NDI are probably in the same place we are these days. We're growing like nobody's business and hiring people right and left. And I've been doing job interviews for folks coming into IRI at our, what we call senior program associate and program associate levels. You know, again, I'm going to refer to my age, but something that really drives me crazy about younger folks who we're looking to hire is people who can't write English. I would just say, please, please, please be super careful about the way you communicate. You know, whether it's in a cover letter or in a CV, make sure that all the editing is done. It's a small thing. It really is a very, very small thing, right? But you got to get the small things right in order to get the big things right. Because if I can't get past that, then I'm not going to get to the next thing that I'd like to see, which is some kind of political experience, particularly in the world that I work in, right? I don't care if you work for Joe Biden or you work for Donald Trump or you work for, I don't care. It makes no difference to me, right? But I want to see that you put yourself out there. And Nancy will sympathize with this. There is nothing on the planet like having to go out and talk to real voters and ask them to vote for you, right? It is a desperately humbling experience, right? And I don't say that everybody should run for office, because not everybody can run for office, but there are lots of ways to engage in the political process, to be able to get that on your resume and frankly, get it into your back pocket and say, you know what I learned from being on my board of supervisors? You know what I learned from being on my zoning council or whatever it was, right? It doesn't matter to me. It really doesn't matter. But there is something desperately, truly humbling in doing that. And to me, that builds character. I understand that not everybody on the phone call comes from a place in the world necessarily where you can do that. But to me, that's a big plus, right? And then the last thing, and I know it's kind of trite, but I'm going to say it anyway. There's got to be something in your life that you can communicate to a potential employer, somebody that you're looking to work for, that makes you fundamentally different from the 300 other applications that we get in our inbox, right? And that can be that you play the cello at a competitive level, or that you were the quarterback of your college football team, right? Whatever it is, I don't care what it is, makes no difference to me, right? But something that makes you stand out, so that when I get to the end of the day and I have to choose among 3 people, I say to myself, you know what? That's the one that strikes me as different from the others.
I echo everything there and emphasize the writing skills. Your generation can't write. I don't know.
Oh, not at all.
I don't know what went wrong in your high school. I got great high school English, and it just stuns me how bad, and it's part of the test. If you can't write a decent cover letter and resume, I just don't even look at it. But it's more than that. You actually have to know how to write memos. And so if you don't, go learn it, take some writing courses. And people are busy. So if you can't write a 3-page memo that gets the key points across, you are not going to succeed. So that is a critical skill. The other thing is networks and mentors. You will not succeed if you don't have both. And women are terrible at both. Maybe because we're busier, or we just think, and there's an attitude of men say, oh, of course I can do that job. And women say, well, I could never do that job. And they're equally qualified. And where does that attitude come from? And so for women in particular, they don't go out for a beer or play golf. They're home raising the kids. I don't know what it is, but take the time to learn that network. And the younger you are, the better, because you get really busy as you get older. And so try and find people who are in your field that you can just have an honest conversation with. Because if you don't do that, what happens is you'll go into a meeting, you won't understand the dynamics. Half the times the meeting is not really where things are decided. It's where everyone has a chance to say things, so they feel like they're part of the decision, but it's really being made outside in a smaller group. So you got to get that understanding of the context. And it's not just water cooler, it's lunches, it's going for a walk, it's talking to them, getting to know them. And the other thing I would say is talk to your bosses. If you think you ought to have that job, make it clear that, yeah, I'm taking this job, but in 2 years I want to be here, and check in and say, what more do I need to do? Make it clear. And women are terrible at that. And just recognize that you can be there, but no one's going to just give it to you. You got to make it clear that you want it. Very rarely, when I was on the National Security Council at the White House, and so I knew how people were working jobs behind the scenes, and it taught me a lot of lessons, because these guys were working the phones nonstop. And then they publicly get a big fat job, and they pretend like, oh, the president just called me and asked me to do this. And I'm like, are you kidding me? So know that none, and watch this right now with the Biden people. I'm watching all the people trying to angle, and then they'll just say, oh, I just happened to get invited. So ask for it, work it. And I would say also, and this is going to sound weird, but I really mean it, don't make mistakes that are avoidable. never guess. And everyone's going to make a mistake. But if you're the person is the go-to person that says, you know, Neil, I know if I give Neil something to do, he might take a little longer than I hope, but it's because he knows that he doesn't know everything yet. Clarify the questions. Like, I have a bad habit of just asking people to do stuff, assuming they can read my mind. And I always tell people that work with me, if I'm not clear, ask me. So if you don't know what you're trying to do, and never, ever guess. And the hardest words for younger people is to say, I don't know. It's okay if you don't know. You're learning. So make sure that you clarify what the question is and say, you know, I'm not sure about that, but let me get back to you. What's my deadline? And then if the deadline's unrealistic, say, well, I can get you half the answer, but if you really want it, and be clear about what you want. And then, you know, and you have that feeling in your stomach that just says, that doesn't feel right. Listen to that, because that means you're guessing. And just go get the information and ask for help in getting it if you don't know how to do it. The last thing I would say is go with your gut on what you want to do. Life's like careers are like a V. So if you want to be a lawyer or a doctor, you can start out here and be a doctor, and then you get up here and you realize, I don't really want to do that. So you got to go around and go back to law school and start up. The gulf between changing as you get older is much harder. So when you're young, listen to your gut. If you have a feeling, the job's okay, run away, start over, because it's so much easier. And a good way to do it, as I hope every one of you, it sounds like a lot of you have already done this, but if you haven't thought about grad school, you have to get a grad degree. Europe, you can get a grad degree in 1 year at LSE or Oxford. Here, it's more, if you want to get a PhD, fine. If you have all the time in the world, there's no really reason to get a PhD unless you want to teach. And, you know, think about what you really want to do. And if you get this feeling, I can't believe I get to do that, and you want to run home and tell your family, like, this is the best job ever, that's the feeling you should get. And if you don't have it now, change, because you'll regret it. Last thing I would say is think about the US government. It's a really cool place to work. So the CI has analysts, it has tech people, it has budget analysts, the State Department the same, there's a DIA, there's DHS. You can go in and learn just incredible things. You don't have to do it for 30 years. You can do it for 10 years. You can do it for 5 years. Just learn new skills and try it out, because it'll make you much broader in whatever area that you go. They'll stop that.
Right. Jan, Nancy, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Such a wonderful discussion. I want to thank everyone who joined us tonight. I do want to plug one more thing. If you are not currently a YPFP member, someone passed along this invitation, I encourage you all to become a member today. In fact, YPFP is offering a free year of membership. I wish I was doing that. If you use the code THANKSYPFP, the code is THANKSYPFP, when you fill out an application on our website at ypfp.org. I believe Mark was so kind as to put that in the chat. This offer is only good for the month of November, so don't wait too long. All right, I want to thank you all one more time for attending. Please take care of yourselves, and we hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you guys very much. Neil, this was fun, and Jan, it was great. We'll have to do this again.
Same here. Thanks all around.
And Neil, stay in touch. It's so nice to see you.
Of course.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, great stuff, Neil.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate it.
I didn't do much. I was just here. I was making
That's what I need. I just needed the moral support on the side.
Everybody on the crowd. Anyways, I'm going to stop recording here.